We're starting in 5, 4, 3, 2. So we told you guys that on our show we had Chris Spangle from Indianapolis area, as well as Dave Houston, and they were both on our show talking about libertarianism and stuff like that. And they eventually went off and had another conversation on their own, which is something that, correct me if I'm wrong, Al, that's what we want people to do out of this, as opposed to people being out there and angry at each other all the time. If you don't understand where somebody else is coming from, go out and talk to them.
Conversations come up with other good conversations.
Yes. So what we did is they got on, they talked to each other, and we recorded that conversation, and here it is. It's that simple.
All right, Chris. So thanks for taking the time to talk with me. I after our last discussion, there was a bunch of questions I had, and I just thought the topic was really interesting. So I wanted to get together and continue the discussion on libertarianism and sort of the ways that we can think about libertarianism in today's society. So
sure.
Let's
just take a moment, and just in case people didn't listen and they're like, who are these two on Al and Frank's channel? Maybe introduce yourself and then I'll go.
Sure. My name is Dave Houston, and I've been a friend of Frank's for a long time, and we grew up together, and it's just interesting to talk to some of his guests and give my point of view on a couple of subjects. So I'm just enjoying the time.
And my name is Chris Spangle, and I'm the host of We Are Libertarians, and I know Frank through the Bob and Tom show, where I do all the web stuff, and he and I got talking politics one day, and he was like, I'm doing this podcast. You want to come on? And so I said, sure. So I came on for a couple episodes, talked a whole bunch, and Dave sent word through Frank, like, hey, I want to hear him talk some more. And I couldn't believe that anybody wanted to hear me say anything else. But
come on.
So here we are, the JV squad of the Al and Frank Try to Be Serious podcast.
Definitely. But I just think there's a lot going on recently in the news, a lot going on in the world. And I just thought that getting a sort of libertarian take on certain things would be a good for me personally, in terms of my development and my development in my belief system and my politics. So I just, I was taken by our conversation when you talked a little bit about empathy as being the sort of foundation of libertarianism, and I struggled with that a little bit, because on the one hand, I think of empathy as reaching out to your neighbor and helping out, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when you apply that to situations that we have, like geopolitically, whether you're talking about like Syria or Afghanistan or things like that, the non-interventionism that libertarians espouse, like how do you think of empathy and apply it in a broader sphere geopolitically? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually, just our most recent episode, we talked about Venezuela, and I said to the guys that I was in the chat room with, and I said, this is when it sucks to be a libertarian, because it feels like the right thing to do is intervene and get involved. And I think that we have this view of intervention. I don't know if you've seen Jericho on Netflix. It's like an old TV show. It's like the #1 cult. It's really good. It's a really good TV show. I just watched it. And it's about this Kansas town that a nuclear blast takes place. And it's just the first season's the fallout from this nuclear blast. And they're just struggling to survive. And then there's this moment, there's two moments where the military comes in. And it's just like this huge relief. And everybody is so excited and happy because their troubles are over and there's some sense of order now. And I think we think that when we actually go into Syria and intervene, or when we go into Iraq and intervene, or Afghanistan, that we bring a sense of order. And in some cases we do. In Afghanistan, we bring some sense of order. But the problem, the reason that I'm a non-interventionist, and this was the last piece of my libertarianism. I mean, this is the part that ironically was the last thing for me to give up. In my thinking, it was very challenging. And now it's probably the thing that I'm most motivated by, because I look at the results. And so I always say I'm a libertarian, not because of greed or selfishness or whatever kind of stereotype you might know. It's because I look at results. And the reality is that when we get involved in these other countries, the results never really turn out that well. We end up making things a lot worse because I don't think there's anybody that would look at a lot of government programs like the VA, which we can directly control through law, that we'd look at and go, this makes sense. This is a really well-run program. So I think, elections are really kind of one of the few things that we do right, but everything else that the government does, just in our opinion as a society, doesn't do well. Okay. And it's even worse when you start applying that to local populations that don't share our culture, our laws, our set of values. And so when you look at the results of the last 20, 30 years, and you look at a place like Iraq or Syria or some of these other locations and how they've turned out, we made a miscalculation that the Bush doctrine, the Wilson doctrine, which are sort of the same thing, which is let's export American democracy to other places. It just doesn't work everywhere. It doesn't mean that democracy can't flourish, but it does mean that the people who are on the ground in those locations have to decide how that works, how they make it work for themselves. And a place like Venezuela, let's go back to that example.
Yeah.
So for those who don't really understand what's going on, in Venezuela right now, in the 90s, you had Hugo Chavez come up, and there was a right-wing American-backed dictator, for all intents and purposes, that was taking the oil resources, which they have the biggest reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia even, and they were taking the profits and they were giving it to the right-wing elite in the country. And Hugo Chavez came along and said, this belongs to the people. And it legitimately did. All the oil reserves is on public land and have been forever. And so he said, let's completely turn this upside down. Let's give the profits back to the people. Let's create, access to free medicine, free healthcare, free education. And they could do that when they had all these massive oil profits through the 90s and 2000s. But then around 2010, right around when he started to pass away, all that plummeted. And so they could no longer afford all those social programs. And, Chavez died of cancer, Maduro took over. And as things really went south, he clamped down to maintain power. And so they had done a couple things where they took over the Supreme Court, they took over the legislature, and I'm getting to a point soon, but I think we got to get into the weeds to make this point.
Right.
So Maduro basically has rigged an election this past year, a recall election, and the president of one of the two legislatures that they have said that he's illegitimate, and so therefore under our Constitution, I'm the acting head of the government until we can hold a new election. So you have a constitutional crisis between these different groups, the pro-Maduro socialists and the non-Maduro people. And so we have a constitutional crisis in a place like Venezuela. And the American government, the Canadians really kind of led the way, and several other Western countries have said, he's the legitimate head of the government. We're going to meet with them as diplomats, and Maduro's non-legitimate. And he's backed by Russia and China because he owes a tremendous amount of money to them, and they want to get paid back. And so you have the beginnings of what happened in Syria, in Venezuela, where Russia and China and, in Turkey and Iran backed Assad, and then the United States backed rebel groups. And then what usually happens in these interventions is American politicians start lining up and saying, we support the rebels, we support the freedom fighters, we support the other side.
Right.
And we give the idea to the populations on the ground that we will be there with military support. Because there will come a time when an armed conflict will take place when you have this kind of divided government. I mean, think about how divided we are, and we still have some legitimacy in terms of how we think about our legal system. Well, they don't have
Right,
that.
right.
And so the problem with interventions is that eventually we say, yes, we're with you, we're with you, we're with you. And then when the time comes and we really have to cash that check, we don't. We give indirect support, and it's always it's always too weak. And what you do is you end up having Russia or China or some other interfering country arm the existing government that has control of all the existing military. They then slaughter the people that you were backing,
Right.
and it turns into a Syrian situation. And so we've seen this in Libya. We've seen this in Syria. So when I look at it from an empathetic point of view, I try to put myself in the shoes of those other countries too. If I'm a Venezuelan, and polls are showing this, the reason we have Chavez is because of colonialism and imperialism and the Monroe Doctrine and the United States thinking that they control the Western Hemisphere. And he came to power because he was fighting the great Satan. You may remember the UN when he's standing behind Bush going, oh, it smells like sulfur here.
Right.
And so our interferences bring these guys to power. And then we continually back right-wing guys like in Chile, Pinochet, who was a right-wing dictator, but he was backed by us, so he was good. And we become kind of the thing that creates misery for the local populations. It's like if Russia right now said, we don't find Donald Trump to be a legitimate president because of, well, let's say China, because of Russian interference, or Angela Merkel said,
you may want to choose a different one.
Yeah, let's say Angela Merkel in Germany and the EU said, we're only going to deal with Nancy Pelosi. Your president isn't legitimate. Like, as Americans, wouldn't we all put on tri-corner hats, grab our muskets, and fight the British again? Like, it's sort of arrogant.
Do you feel that?
So, go ahead.
Do you feel that motivations matter? I mean, do you feel, I think of the fact that, look at where we have involved ourselves in the past and the reasons behind that involvement, right? So I look at things like, I look at Venezuela, and you're right, with the world's largest oil reserves, it makes sense for us to create stability in Venezuela. We have a national interest in doing that. But then I also think of things like Rwanda, where a lot of the European countries would send in troops to try to pacify Rwanda, and we had no interest because Rwanda had nothing that we wanted.
Right.
And so I look at, for example, Ireland. When Ireland sent troops to Rwanda, they did so out of, in my opinion, true empathy, right? A true sense of wanting to help the Rwandan situation and the Rwandan people. But we don't seem to get involved in those types of conflicts that don't, Darfur or what have you. We're not really interested in the empathetic approach to intervention. We're interested in more of the Machiavellian kind of approach to intervention. You and I are, but the people who run our government seem to back the people who have financial interest in it. I think there's a good reason that there's a reason Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation hasn't been investigated. And it's because that's business as usual. The Frank Justers of the world get mining rights to certain things, and they get clearance from the State Department because it's good for American business. I think we have, and this is sort of where my libertarianism starts to sound like a democracy now, like leftist, but I think if you think about government power, you think about who controls the government, and I don't really think it's us, because look at how many of the people who are in power were sure Hillary Clinton was going to win, and this is the one time where we all surprised them. And and that's what I think a lot of the Russia investigation is. No one who's been charged in the Russian investigation has been charged with a crime that was committed in 2016. Most of them are after the Mueller investigation started with process crimes. And so it is a lot of people, and it is a bit of the deep state argument, although I don't think that the deep state is, like this big network of people. But I do think that it is common sense to think that people network together naturally, and the powerful network with each other. I did a podcast today. We have something called The Swamp Explained, where I talk to
a friend of mine who works in Washington, he was the issues director for George H.W. Bush, and he was telling me, he was the third hire on the 1980 campaign, and he was telling me how his job was to set up meetings for prep for George H.W. Bush at Kennebunkport. And, he's talking about all these establishment guys that come in and start telling H.W., here's what we think about this. And I just kind of said, like, at what point does somebody who is not part of the establishment, do they get in that room? And the answer is no. So
but it doesn't have to be some broad conspiracy to keep them out necessarily. It's just more of a, wealth begets wealth and power begets power. And that's just the circle you run in. And
absolutely,
there's not some grand conspiracy where people are meeting and dividing up the world. They all just do what they do, but they know that in doing what they do, it's in benefit of them.
They're helping their college buddies.
Right, exactly.
Like you help your college buddies. You just didn't go to Yale.
Right, exactly.
And so it used to not be that way. I mean, it was really Kennedy who brought in the Harvard guys first, and then it turned into Yale guys now. But, I'm not a conspiracy theorist because I've been around government so long that I just understand the insanity of bureaucracy and the folly that follows.
Right.
I never can, but it is foolish to think that there aren't a group of people who have a shared interest, and you and I being in charge is not one of their interests. It is making sure that there is stability where the world's resources take place. And so, there's a guy who wrote a book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And I don't know how valid it is, but it seems, if you look into it, to be a fairly valid premise, and that his job was to go to these countries on the behalf of multinational corporations and governments and get loans for the IMF or the World Bank and the UN loan money to a Venezuela or a Nigeria against their resources, and then all those resources get sucked out to the Western countries,
right?
And then the local populations are left with nothing, and that's fairly
which is exactly what China is doing in Africa.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, they're very methodical about how they're going about it.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense. I hesitate when people talk about deep state, because I don't think that the government is coordinated enough to be able to pull off something like that.
It takes very little to get into a position of power in this country. Like if you are bright enough and work hard enough and get to Yale, you're pretty much in. Like here's my friend who is, in his 60s now. He just was in the right places at the right time, and then ends up in the room with the future president of the United States. Like,
right.
So I think conspiracy theorists want to assign order when there is chaos, because there has to be, their brains can't handle that level of chaos and dysfunction. Like I just don't buy, but I do think that there is, I think it's a two-part thing. I do think there are some people, the Kissingers of the world, who understand in a post-Cold War, or in a Cold War era or a post-World War II era, we need the United States to position itself to, now that the European powers are battered,
right.
We need to position ourselves to protect these resources and protect the West and protect us from the USSR. And then a lot of people go along with it, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like Max Boot just wrote an article or a tweet saying, Afghanistan needs to be like the Indian Wars, where they're just there for 100 years, and so Americans, that's not a guy who is sitting there thinking about enriching, multinational corporations. That's a guy who just goes along, and this is the system and we need to protect it. It's the argument that if we pull out of Afghanistan, everybody's going to get slaughtered. Well, that's probably not true, because at the end of the day, we've lessened and lessened and lessened our involvement, and the Taliban has taken over more and more territory, to the point that we're largely irrelevant and powerless in Afghanistan. We're just still throwing a ton of money at it.
Right. Do you think that that sort of old boy network and the smoke-filled rooms and the deal making, I mean, there's a part of me, it's very anti-democratic, but there's a part of me that says that creates an efficient system, right? And it might not be the most democratic approach, but it is an efficient system. We do move forward. And I look at countries like China, where they have a vision that they're putting in place, and they're sort of Russia too, right? And they're doing it in a very organized, methodical fashion. And one of the things that is a hallmark of that is there is no opposition. So I look at that and I say, okay, here you have a country like China that before 1990 wasn't even in the top 10 in terms of GDP, right? And they're set to surpass us in the span of 25 years, right? And they do that because they have a plan, they're working the plan, there is no opposition, and they're moving in a very efficient manner. And then you look at the United States where, for a long period of time, we were the dominant force. And I just feel like, in a way, we almost need to go back to that smoke-filled room deal-making to get progress.
It's not a matter of going back to it. Like, we invented it. So if you go back to the founding of the country, it is the elite of this island, basically, that got together and said, let's give them a choice, but not too much choice. If the entire American system was designed to balance a couple things, because they knew that if you have too much democracy and too many warring factions, that's what brought down Rome. That's, if you read Mike Duncan's great book, I forget what the name of it's Before the Storm, something. Mike Duncan is the guy. He wrote basically that 150-year slide of the Republic into Caesarian dictatorship. And what you see is too many warring factions, too many demagogues can easily manipulate the crowds. And one of the things I worry about is that with social media, we have too many crowds. And I think part of our dysfunction is almost too much democracy. There's a libertarian thinker named Hans Hoppe who wrote the book called Democracy, the God That Failed, and basically argues for stateless dictatorships because it is efficient. And so, America invented the idea of a ruling elite appointing the senators and, the people electing the House, but we get the senators to make sure that you people don't get a little too crazy. Right. And we have a de facto king, and then there's another check on that. And so what they tried to do is balance. They understood exactly what you're saying, but they wanted to try and create democracy, but not too much democracy. Right. And that's where you see the massive amount of growth. And so you had the real reason we're in American power is that we were the bank for both sides of, the First World War. And then we were the bank for the Second World War. And that influx of capital really created the superpower that we are. And so, that's why we want to stay the world's currency reserve. We want to stay. So we're not going back to that. We are there. Like, the people who are in the elite circles still control things. Like, you and I can make a difference. We can become part of those elites in some ways, but.
And that's what I struggle with, right? Is when you look at like Howard Schultz throwing his hat in the ring, and you've got Bloomberg, and you've got a lot of people that lean a little bit more left socially, like I do. I'm sort of drawn to them, but at the same time, I have to remind myself these are all billionaires. These are all when we talk about the average man, they're not representative of that.
But they also could lose to like the absolute poor people that are Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris. So there is some balance within the system. And I think a Howard Schultz, we do want to be a Michael Bloomberg or Howard Schultz. It's like every businessman that you knew in the 80s. My dad was a small businessman who wanted to be Donald Trump. Like that like in the 80s, he was the guy that everybody wanted to be because he was a self-made man, and that, we know isn't true now. But there's the American system affords people the ability to rise up into that class. And I find the argument that Howard Schultz isn't qualified because he's a white billionaire, a white male billionaire, to be ludicrous, because here's a guy who could manage the bureaucracy, who could manage all these competing visions. Whereas a Kamala Harris, who really doesn't have a lot of experience, I think part of the problem that is lending credence to your argument is that Barack Obama and Donald Trump had no ability to manage a bureaucracy. But who's the best president in our lifetime in terms of managing policy and getting it passed, it's Bill Clinton, who had, a decade at least of experience of managing bureaucracy in Arkansas. George Bush was fairly effective, and he was governor. So, so I think there, I look at it and I go, I get what you're saying. I want that efficiency, but I also don't want these lunatic billionaires. Why does Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, why are we also invested what these two lunatics decide? We're arguing over the shutdown because these two lunatics have all the power. And so we're living and dying, and people are starving and selling their heirlooms to make rent because these two people have their ego just can't allow them to compromise. So that's where I go. The system needs to be reformed, and it means taking less power. And I go back to the original American system. The government needs to be most powerful where it's closest to you. And if we can convince enough people that that's the case, then evolve that to where you don't even need a local government, And so
I just think of from an efficiency standpoint, I see what you're saying and I get it. But from an efficiency standpoint, I look at a centralization as being able to push through efficient reform quickly, I guess would be the word, because we are in a global competition.
Yeah, but it's easier to buy. It's easier to buy them off. It's more efficient if you have more people that the corporations have to buy off. And I know that you're thinking in terms of the government is the one that produces success, and government robs success. It is the free market that provides solutions. And when you look at any industry, there's a book called The Crisis of the Leviathan, and it's by Robert Higgs, and it shows you over American history, step by step, how the central government has been able to consolidate power, and it has just created more and more intraction. I don't think you can look at a time in American history where there's more centralized power than there is in Washington, D.C., and there's more dysfunction and less ability to pass anything than ever before.
Yeah. But do you believe we live in a free market?
Not quite. I mean, I think if you look at anything in your room or anything in front of you, there is some level of government that is touching that.
Right.
And so, we have a freer market than most, but we're not quite Hong Kong, which is shrinking, or Singapore, and so when you look at Hong Kong, it was the most successful part of China until China took it over from the British. And now it's dwindling in Cato's statistics in terms of economic freedom. So you have the freedom to go out and start a business, but you have to get government permission first. You have patent laws, you have copyrights, you have more freedom than maybe other places, but you still do have a lot of government intervention, and you have to ask permission for a lot of things.
Well, and I think, you're absolutely right. I think of, when you talk about free markets, there's two different ways of looking at it in my mind. One of them is from the standpoint of government involvement, which would be regulation, right? Mm-hmm. The other is it truly a free market? Are you truly able to compete fairly with other entrants into the marketplace, right? And that's where I get a little bit, I don't know what the word is, a little bit confused in the sense that, is it a free market or is it a rigged economy? Not necessarily. Take the regulation arguments away for a moment and think of it in terms of who dominates markets. Mm-hmm. And are you able to actually effectively compete in today's day and age, or is your fate somewhat determined by those who already dominate the markets?
Here's the problem. So there's always, it doesn't matter if you have the government we have now or if you have a pure free market, there's always going to be a boom and a bust cycle. There's always going to be a growth, a centralization of power, a busting of that power, and then a diffusion again. The problem is that when the government is in charge of regulation, that cycle is way longer, and it's way harder for justice to prevail, and it's way easier for the corporations to hide their misdeeds because they can buy off regulators. And so if you think in terms of things that you use in your own life, like if you watch movies, like watching this Jericho show from 2005, it looks like pretty much 2018. Like it really looks exactly the same. The houses kind of look the same, the decorations, but what's the thing that when you watch a movie from the 2000s that looks completely different than what you have in your hand now? What is it?
Cell phone.
Cell phone.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the internet and the massive amount of innovation that you've been able to create in a short amount of time, like 15 years ago, we didn't have Uber. Facebook had just begun. Like YouTube didn't exist. You know, when you think about the things 20 years ago that millennials alone, which I'm the oldest millennial at 35, like think about the corporations that they've been able to start because they have almost all you have to do is sit down and create a website.
Right.
And there, you don't have to ask, you may have to go to your Secretary of State and get a piece of paper, but you know, you grow into a Facebook. And
but
so
does that go back to your comment of you know the Harvard buddies taking care of each other, where you enter that elite club, but then that elite club becomes the determining factor as to what can make its way into the market, because that elite club then controls the regulatory body, right?
Well, but a Harvard attendee, I don't think he graduated like Mark Zuckerberg. You know, Tom from MySpace didn't go to Harvard. You know, so you know, I am able, because I have a website and a podcast, I can compete with CNN, like for people's attention. It's the great equalizer, and that's because there's no regulation. And it puts more power into the consumer's hand, which I think is a good thing. And so you have the ability as a consumer to get the things that you really want and the things that you really like. And if they're bad, if people are leaving Facebook not because the government is telling them to leave Facebook, they're doing that because they realize this is not helpful to me or my health. I don't trust these people. And so you're starting to see the erosion of their business. And so you can see the bust of that company coming. But the problem with regulation is that Facebook and Twitter and some of these other companies, as much as they protest regulation, they welcome it. And the reason is that every time in American history we've had one of these great conflagrations where we need to regulate this organization and this group of people, they get bought in and then they cement their position in the marketplace and absolutely squeeze out anyone else, because they're the ones who can afford to pay off the congressman for $2,000 a pop. And so then they write regulations that make it virtually impossible for someone else to start a business.
Right.
So, like, if you want to get into building electronics, you know, healthcare is a great example of an industry that was fairly free market and fairly easy to access, and then you have Richard Nixon create the HMO Act in '71, and then that's when the insurance companies basically set up the system that benefited them, you know, and then Barack Obama tried to reshuffle that and in favor of the free of your regular person. And if you read America's Bitter Pill, you see, oh, the insurance companies got you again. So so it is the power. If you can afford to point the gun at whomever you'd like to point the gun at, and I know that there were some people that in the last couple podcasts really took exception with the idea of government force, but you really have to think about it. Like, if you don't use Facebook or you choose to opt out of Facebook, there isn't anything they can do about it. But if you choose not to pay your taxes, somebody is eventually coming to knock on your door and put you in jail. And that is just the reality. Government is popular in terms of solutions because it's force. And so
does the government have a role as perhaps a referee? I mean, what do you put in place to ensure that at the end of the day, one person doesn't control all the resources?
It's just a virtual impossibility. Like this is a common concern with libertarianism is the what if.
Right.
And what you always have to point back and say is that not happening now with a lot of regulation? Like you have a better chance of upending the system by having someone come along and create and innovate than you do in a system like we have now. And so who is the referee? It's you and me. It's our pocketbook. It's who we decide has all the power. And the problem with our system now is you and I don't decide who has the power.
Yep.
We're subject to whoever has the power because we don't have enough money to buy the power.
Right.
So libertarianism is really about putting it back into the hands of regular people. And that's where empathy comes into play, because, you know, with overseas, our government is tilting the power in favor of who they would like to have the power. In business, they're tilting it in favor of who they'd like to have the power. It's the people at the top that are doing that.
Right.
And what I want is the people at the bottom to have the power to tell the people at the top, you're not in power anymore. And it's a more fair and equitable system where people make decisions based on, like, really, when you think about where you spend your dollars, like restaurants are fairly free, right?
Right.
I don't go to a lot of chain restaurants, and it's because I get to know the people that work at the local restaurants. They're part of my community. I want to support them. Like when you really think about how you spend your own money, like you kind of hate that you have to go to a place like a Walmart because they're just so big and evil, and the media has done all these pieces on them that make them look bad. And so you go to Meijer or you go to the mom and pop shop and you make choices that, you know, the green, like we didn't need the government to tell corporations to go green. We as consumers have said we want you to be environmentally friendly, and then all of a sudden P&G and Johnson & Johnson are running ads saying, look at how green we are. It's the marketplace that really made that decision for those companies, not the government. So
but then look at, okay, so I agree with that, but then take the situation of the current backlash against climate change and the current coal rolling and everything like that. Where does that fit into your last statement, right? I mean, it feels like you're right. The marketplace is demanding a certain thing, and companies are stepping up to do that. But then you have this countervailing force that I don't know in terms of who's funding it or what have you, but that is fighting against that to go backwards, right?
Right. I mean, there's always going to be some level of misinformation in a society. Not misinformation, disinformation. There's a difference. People, like there's no doubt that, some think tanks are funded by oil companies to discredit climate change. But let me ask you, why do you think that those, all right, when you look at the proposals of climate change legislation, like have you looked into the Green New Deal at all?
Not in depth, no. Okay.
It is a complete nationalization of all industry in the United States. Like, I'm not even exaggerating. I mean, we did an episode on it where we broke it down. Like, you listen to it and you go, "Wow, okay." And we start with the propaganda around it to instill. They're instilling fear in kids across the nation. Like, we're all going to die in 10 years. Well, you said that 10 years ago. Like, you and I are old enough to know that's bullcrap. But an 18-year-old doesn't know any different because this is the first time they're experiencing life as an adult. So, of course, I just believe what Ocasio-Cortez says, and so I think she believes what she says. But, there's so disinformation happens on both sides of the issue. But when you sit down and watch Vice and watch a piece of journalism and they take a camera up to the polar, the polar caps, you go, oh, there's no doubt that this is happening. I get it now. Okay. And so you can cut through that disinformation very quickly. So propaganda, a lot of times when truth is easily available, and it's easily available when there's more journalism, when there's more conversations like this, like it gets cut through pretty quickly. So I'd never find the argument, we need the government to do X to protect us from propaganda. It's like the government's the best propagandist in the game. They invented it. So So going back to climate change,
but it's not just propaganda. I mean, you have people in power now that are pushing legislation, that are pushing agendas to actively roll back any moves toward, for example, alternative energy. Right. So
because the proposals that are outlined, something like a cap and trade system or a tax on carbon or a Green New Deal, these things are so fundamentally opposed to the free market, and you're going to impose that on people. And so, you're scaring people with the force that would be brought about to control industries. Like, you're basically saying it's sort of the Atlas Shrugged argument, where the government is just passing these regulations and taking over the companies. And then, there's the last holdout, the Harry Stantons or whatever his name is. I never read the book. I just watched the horrible movies. But, like like I don't know if you own a company, but like, you built that. Who is the government to tell you that you need to hire a compliance officer to force you how you ought to run your business? Like, you as a business owner are reasonable enough to know what you should or should not do. And if you're not, insurance companies will be happy to help you understand what your risk assessment is.
Yeah.
So I look at it and I go, yeah, there's a lot of like freak out over this stuff, but it always goes back to somebody trying to impose their values on somebody else. And that's really what people are rejecting. They're rejecting being told what to do.
Right.
And it's not they're rejecting the idea of climate change. That happens because people aren't complex. They're not thinking it through in certain ways. They're not like, people think of things in very simplistic terms.
Yeah, the knee-jerk reaction is to say that it's not real, right? Because you don't want to have to accept the implications of saying that it's real.
Right. Like, I think gay marriage is a great example. It's very illustrative of what I'm saying. I think most people have absolutely no idea with two people living the way that they want to live or loving the way they want to love. But when gays are told by Christians, you're not allowed to live this way, they are in the streets. And then when you're told how to run your business and you have to bake that cake, then they start passing religious freedom laws. Like, that's the back and forth is not that gays and Christians hate each other. Yeah. It's that they don't want to be forced to live the other way the other one wants. And so if you remove that and say, you know what, let's get rid of government marriage altogether. It was only put in place to keep blacks and whites from marrying 100 years ago. Look it up. That's the truth. And so when you remove the force, you say, and we're going to get rid of marriage contracts passed by legislations. So now you, instead of going to a divorce lawyer, are going to a marriage lawyer. And you're sitting down with the person you're about to marry. You're writing out, if things go wrong, you get this, I get this, how's this going to work, who gets the kids? And then all of a sudden, there'd be so fewer marriages because people would start to see what they actually value in life.
Right. Like, they'd have to do it up front. Yeah.
We'd have the divorce rates would plummet because people would actually start to marry people that they have common shared interest with. And so, it's the force at the end of the day. It's making people live the way that you think they ought to live. Well, whose business, Dave? I don't care what you think about my life.
Yeah.
I'm an intelligent adult that wants to live the way I want to live. So get off my back, get out of my face.
But you bring up a good point that I sort of, when I think about libertarianism, that I struggle with, and that is the public versus the private sphere, right? Mm-hmm. So when you talk about, for the most part, we are fairly free in our private lives, right? What we do in our house, for the most part, is fairly free.
Right.
But my approach is sort of, do whatever you like as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else in the private sphere. When you enter the public sphere, that's where the gray area comes in, or the difficulty in implementing a libertarian ethos comes in, because in my mind, the public sphere should just be one big empty space, right? It should just be one, I don't know what the word is.
Non-existent.
Well, not necessarily non-existent, but just empty, devoid of religious overtones, devoid of societal norm overtones, right? Just sort of a place where it's different. If you don't want to invite a gay couple into your home, you don't have to, right? But if you are operating a business in the public sphere, if you are out in the public sphere, I think the rules should be different in the public than it is in the private. Does that make sense? Or
Yes, I think I know what you're saying. So allow me to kind of repeat that back. So,
yeah.
So, you hang a shingle on your door, then there's certain expectations of how you conduct your business to the public face.
Right.
All right. So common law was developed, and that's the basis of the American legal system, the British legal system, the French legal system. It's just like over a period of hundreds and thousands of years, common laws just kind of developed. Like, you don't need to pass a law to know that two people living in a house are married. Like, they're living a life together. They're putting it together. It's the common law marriage idea. So common law really took care of a lot of societal organization before we really got to, because even in the time of kings, like, a king couldn't really come down and govern over, and even in America today, like, I had my tires stolen. Like, do you think that the government came down and helped me investigate who took my tires? No. Like, really, at the end of the day, I'm in charge of my own self-protection. That's why, the government isn't going to come and investigate. They're not going to protect my property. They're not going to protect my person. In fact, the Supreme Court says that if you call the police, they don't have to respond, which was just upheld 3 weeks ago in another ruling. Like, you're really responsible for yourself. And so if you're really responsible for yourself, shouldn't you have self-government? And so what rules govern you and I are, like, what rules the government passes in Washington, D.C., 535 guys and another one signing this piece of paper. Like, it really, most of the time, doesn't affect you and me. Right. What affects you and I are the rules of human engagement and human behavior. And those are so set in our DNA that common laws just kind of develop. Like, it's outrageous to people that if you put a shingle up, you set up an implicit contract that you're going to let anybody come into your business and you're going to serve everybody. And it's an outrage to just the human animal if we say, no, I'm going to only allow certain types of people in. Right. Okay, well, then you're a club. Like, but, and that outrage is what spurns the market to put that person out of business, because they violated the social norms of the community. And so you don't need a law at the Supreme Court level to say Masterpiece Cakes can do what they want or can't do what they want, because...
Right, but take that back 50 years, right? Mm-hmm. And when you have the segregated South, and you had the majority of the society that wanted that particular structure. Right. And it required somebody from the outside. It required the federal government to come in and say, no, even though the majority of you want this, you can't have it.
Right. The rules of justice and not fairness, but just justice, like, right, and equality were so absolutely, like, violated in the South that the North had a problem with it forever. And I think, it would have, at this point, with the ability to have the conversations we can have at such a high level, like, there's no doubt in my mind that we don't need the government to pass the civil rights laws. Like, we would all solve that problem ourselves. Like, I think, you look at the police situation that Al brought up, like, that's a situation that conversations are spurned by that. And so people who, are in the deepest parts of Georgia are watching the videos going, there's a problem here. How do I solve it in my own community? Mm-hmm. And so I just think that those common laws and a lot of that, like, yes, in that particular case, like, when you live in a structure where you have a central government and you have state governments, the central government, this is probably an unpopular opinion amongst libertarians, but when you look at the civil rights laws and the absolute violations that were happening in the South, I have a real hard time saying that the Civil Rights Act wasn't a good thing. Right. Right. But I've never actually argued with another libertarian about that. But, like, it just, in terms of my values, justice and equality.
Well, I think you could
common
make
sense.
a libertarian argument, I would think, for the Civil Rights Act, in the sense that not having the Civil Rights Act was a violation of individual freedom, right?
Yeah, I think,
And the individual freedom of the person who was discriminated against.
well,
I don't know.
then this is where I'm going to upset a lot of liberals. Like, the reason that blacks in the South are powerless is because they weren't allowed. I mean, the way that a lot of blacks in the South had power is that they had weapons. The great untold gun rights argument in this country is the Southerners who had weaponry that prevented the Klan from coming and taking their, taking their property, their persons. Like, the gun in the South gave them their power back. If you look at the great movie, The Free State of Jones on Netflix, this entire part of Mississippi or Alabama was like a quarter of the state was free during the Civil War because they upended the power system. So I think that when you look at it and go, well, the civil rights movement would have never happened without the federal government. I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that you'd have the same situation now. That, like, if you look at how quickly the gay marriage thing was settled, like we're talking a decade, and so in our modern environment where technology and information is so prevalent, like, you don't need the same rules that we live by. And that's the great hope for libertarianism, is that things are moving so rapidly that the government can't keep up, and we all just finally realize we don't need the government anymore. And so it's an outdated mode of human organization. And so going back to kind of life without, I don't want to centralize authority, because at the end of the day, think about your life. Your life is your immediate community. It is the people that are around you, and you all can kind of, like, we sit here and the great harassment of libertarians is, what about those people who live 500,000 miles away from you? It's like, I'll never meet them. They're irrelevant to my life, and it's up to them to get their power back, just like it's up to me and my community. Like, we organize into very small groups. Like, we have to think about how the human animal actually developed and start organizing society around the way that our brain works.
But there is a sort of Machiavellian approach to that, which is saying, you are able to organize in your small groups because there is a centralization that is out there ensuring that the oil is flowing, that the resources are coming in, that those other groups that are potentially a threat to your resources are being dealt with. Do you know what I mean? So there is sort of an argument that says that we have that luxury and we have that freedom because there is an entity that is controlling that outside, or attempting to control that outside world.
Do we have petroleum jelly, or do we have the plastic that is in this Logitech camera because a government said, you know what we need to create? Like, the government made Velcro, they get that one. But, like, think about a pencil. Like, who created the pencil? Right. It's that famous iPencil by Leonard Reed. Like, the rubber comes from South America, the zinc comes from Africa, the wood comes from the Northwest, the metal, and it's all put together by a single person, but nobody knows who created the pencil. Somebody just said, I need a more efficient way of writing, and then the market, through spontaneous order, created the pencil. And so when you look at that, it's not because the government centrally planned an economy, it's because it spontaneously developed. It's a planned chaos.
But take it back a little bit further, and that would be the result of, for example, colonialism in rubber plantations, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, I get what you're saying, but the practical side of my mind keeps going to, okay, well, if we do all organize into these smaller groups, who ensures that the interactions with the outside continue in the way that we would need them to continue? That those resources, and I look back to to the approach that China is taking in Africa and other developing countries, where they are going in and they're building the ports, they're going in and they're building the airports, they're going in and they're building the mines, they're creating and embedding themselves in these countries for the sole purpose of being able to ensure that the natural resources and the human resources in those countries, the value from those is funneled back to China.
Right. And they're doing it in a way that supports the local population, unlike the white colonialist of the 1700s who did it by force. Like if you look at the rubber plantation argument, like why are we outraged by the plantation argument? And it's because some people used force on other people.
Right.
And so but continue. Yes. Like,
well, no. And so I look at that and I say, I go back to this idea that we in America have the luxury of having these conversations and the luxury of talking about organizing ourselves in certain ways because we have this externalized entity that is out there ensuring through one way or another that the wealth and the resources and the talent and the labor and whatever we need to continue our livelihood keeps flowing our way, right? And
yes, but do you think that it is because Washington D.C. exists that those things take place?
I think
is it the cause? Is that what produces the wealth?
I think it's a link between those multinationals, those companies that are producing based on those resources that are being extracted, and the government itself, right? So, if that weren't the case, I think we would be a non-interventionist government. But yet we seem to intervene in just about anything that has any bearing on our ability to continue producing and our ability to continue generating wealth for our people, right?
Right.
So I struggle in the sense of how, I look at the world in this way, that we can either choose to engage and compete aggressively, or we can isolate. And I'm concerned that a sort of a libertarian approach or a small organizational approach is a kind of isolation versus a kind of competition.
On the contrary, it's more of a competition than it is an isolation. Because
talk about that, because
right.
That's
Okay.
what I'm coming with.
Yeah, because in the absence of, like, libertarians are not isolationists. We are pro-competition, because I view the future, the way to outmaneuver the Chinese is to be more capitalistic than the Chinese, because they're just not going to do it, because their government is fundamentally flawed. It's a fundamentally communist, top-down approach society. And so, as a student of history, looking at overarching power structures, the United States, the foundation of the United States government was an enormous leap forward. There's a book called The 5,000-Year Leap that basically talked about, like, the 1700s to the 2000s is this massive leap in history. We had more progress in these 300 years than the previous 5,000 because of capitalism. Like, I think if you look at the poverty rates, I mean, have you seen the poverty rates in just since 1990?
I haven't.
Yeah, the world's poverty has been cut in half. Like, it's the poverty rates just over the last 30 years are staggering. And what has happened is that free market capitalism has moved into places where dictators used to reign, where colonialism used to reign, where communism used to reign. And as these formerly communistic countries start to open up, like China is another great example of it, as they go from a command and control economy from the top down and open up their markets, they've become a massive power. And it's through the opening up their resources in terms of human labor and capital.
Right.
And so like the American experiment, the reason that we have become the world's superpower in such a short amount of time, the biggest government, the biggest country, the biggest economy, the biggest everything, is not because a central government existed. It's because a group of men in Philadelphia in 1789 said, all right, let's have just some tiny little guardrails here. Let's centralize the force around the adjudication of justice. So, there can't be competing courts. And this is kind of where I break down in an anarcho-capitalist society where, like, if you subscribe monthly to this private court and I subscribe monthly to this private court, and then I kill somebody in their jurisdiction, like
Right.
like you want a centralization of some force. And so, like, I'm not a full anarchist because I haven't worked that problem out in my mind. I haven't been convinced that that can be done without that one piece of centralization.
Right.
But when you really look at the society, when the American Republic was founded, like, when the federal government tried to like put a tax on something, the Whiskey Rebellion took place. Like, that's how little government actually existed in the founding of this country. And every time it started to grow and grow, people would beat it down, and they would say no. They'd elect a Jackson, and he'd close down the central bank. They'd pay off all the debt, and you'd have like these pockets of growth, and it would pop up. But
Right.
The reason that the country grew so quickly is because people were more free to enact capitalism as they saw it.
Right.
And so the way that we compete in the future is by freeing up our economy to allow people to, like, you have great ideas, I have great ideas. To enact my ideas, I need you and you need me. But you and I don't need each other if we're getting our bread from the government or our medical care from the government. Like, if you really look at American history, with the exception of the black population, I mean, there's no doubt that the South existed on a perverted economic system, an evil economic system. And that's why the South was predominantly more poor than the North, because the North relied on cooperation instead of, keeping people as slaves. And so when that economic frustration is a minor part of why the Civil War started, because they felt the North, there was a class struggle a little bit. So,
Right.
So the growth of wealth does have those inequalities, but the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, that's what lifted people out of this agrarian poor society.
Right. But so do you believe that there is such a thing as the end stage of capitalism? I mean, or do you believe see, I look at it, I'm a capitalist, and I look at it as capitalism creates innovation, it creates wealth. It actually is absolutely instrumental in how we've developed not only as a country, but worldwide. But I also believe that there has to be some entity that comes in to constantly reset the balance, right? In order that the system itself continues to live, to expand and to grow. And so I just get concerned that if you allow capitalism free reign, laissez-faire capitalism, right? What ends up happening is all of the wealth and power is controlled by a handful. Capitalism becomes oligopoly, it becomes kleptocracy or what have you. So I guess my struggle, because I agree with you 100% that capitalism is the driving force of the quality of life that we're seeing in our country. And
it's not even about here. It's really like in India and Africa and South America. Like, they need the West way less because the West is not exploiting their resources. They're cooperating with the West and selling their goods and services to us. And that's what's lifted India, for instance. Like India, we joke about call centers, but like that is a huge opportunity for Indian people to afford food, and that's cooperation. That's not isolation. Like, that's an example where I don't need my government to give them foreign aid. The foreign aid comes from AT&T hiring them.
Right.
So
and I agree with that.
But continue.
I agree with that. Well, no, I agree with that. I guess from my standpoint, I just think of how do you Yeah, I watched an interview. It's an old interview with Sir John. I think it's Sir John Goldsmith. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
But he was talking about, he was one of the original 1980s corporate raiders and ultra capitalist. But what he was saying is that, if you have a situation in which business and government become intertwined, right, then you shatter the relationship between the negotiations of capital and labor. And you tilt the scales such that those two can no longer balance each other out, right? And serve as their own weight in terms of negotiation. But instead, what you're doing is you are tilting the scale. And that then becomes a situation where the economy is no longer viable. Because what will happen is it will run away. It's like a game of Monopoly.
Right.
Right. Eventually, one person wins. So you need some ability for people to effectively combat capital so that they can constantly be in this battle back and forth, which is the only way that capitalism can keep going and going and going versus having an actual end in which one controls all.
But is the government battling corporations?
No, and that I agree. No, they're not, and that's what I'm struggling with. That's why I was asking the question in the very beginning: do you think we live in a free market? Because I kind of believe we don't. I believe that the intertwining and the interactions of government and big business is such that they're inextricable.
So let's go back to his point of government and business can't coexist. So if one has to die, who would you rather die?
No, I agree. It's not that they can't coexist. They can't, they have to be separate entities.
But
right?
They fundamentally, I don't think can be. I think I agree with him in that, the problem with like Elizabeth Warren's Consumer Protection Bureau, it's a great idea because I'm as mad as anybody about, Bear Stearns and all these guys just walking away.
Right.
But like these guys just took the laws that had been written by previous generations of crony capitalists and played within those rules. Yeah. And so, but then they all get off scot-free. And so she comes along and says, let's create the Consumer Protection Bureau where we're going to, regular people are going to get to fight Wall Street, and this is what's going to hold them accountable.
Right.
And the problem with the entire bureau was that it was a bunch of people that Elizabeth Warren had personally selected and Barack Obama had selected to be in that division, and they just started going after Republican donors. Right. And so so instead of protecting everybody, they just started protecting liberals. And so you go back to your question about intentions, the intentions there are so good and I agree with them, but I have to look at the results and I have to go, at some point, the results here are not good because somebody's winning and somebody's losing. And it's because we're asking the government to pick winners and losers when we're the ones that should be doing that. Right. We're the ones who should be selecting who wins and loses. The reason that a Cornelius Vanderbilt can build this railway empire is because he bought off enough politicians. That's the thing. It's the government force that is the missing piece of this equation. And so I wonder, I have to ask you, I feel like you're almost there. I feel like you kind of get it and you're like, I want to agree, but I feel like I need to have the thing named. I will be more comfortable if I can have, it's almost like that conspiracy theory argument where George Bush did 9/11 because I just can't imagine that people would do that. So I need some evil plot to is it that you need to name the thing because the idea of just millions of little decisions by human beings every minute is just too conceptual? It's because to me, I just kind of go, I'm a believer, I'm a Christian. And so I go, I don't fully understand this thing, but I'm just going to kind of take the leap and I believe it.
Go with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's sort of how I feel about capitalism. It's like, if government or business has to die, I'm going to take business and I'm going to trust that thing. Like, I just know gravity works. Like,
right. And I think it comes down to, for me, do I or do I not believe that individuals making the best choices for their individual selves creates a system that lays a foundation for everybody to succeed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are people making, are markets rational? Are people rational? Are they making decisions in their best interest? And by doing so, is that creating decisions that are in our best interest? Or are there situations where what is not necessarily in my individual best interest is still in the best interest of society?
Mm-hmm.
And by creating that society in which we're looking out for each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will I be looked after? And that's what I'm kind of struggling with is do I trust individuals to make decisions for themselves? And in the private sphere, I say yes, right? What they want to do with their lives is their business. But then I say, do I want them to make decisions that have global reaching impacts? I don't know. That's
I mean, the answer for me is no. And so the reason that I look at, so to me, an individual is an individual. A person is a person. Like, I think every person is fundamentally looking out for their own interests. And we make little compromises for the people immediately around us that allow those people to be in our lives. And so, but at the end of the day, like, if somebody has repeatedly violated your boundaries and repeatedly violated your interests, then you move on to a different group of people who might serve your interest and needs better. Like that's just how the human animal operates. And so why do you make the distinction between the human animal in the business side of it and the human animal in the government side of it, and the person who's just kind of like, to me, a person who is president of the United States, like, the thing I love about Donald Trump is that Donald Trump just kind of exposes politics for what it is, which is just a naked exercise in ego. Like, do we really think that Hillary Clinton is making decisions based on what is best for all of America? Or do you think that she's making decisions based on what is in her interests in that moment? And so why do you make the distinction between, like, do you truly believe that when you label it government, that people do actually appeal to a higher cause? Because, like, why do you make that distinction?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know is probably the answer. I mean, at the end of the day, I look at the need for some governing entity, some entity that is going to create the rules under which we get to play, under which we get to compete, under which capitalism gets to take hold, under which society thrives. But there has to be some arbiter, because if you and your friends in Indianapolis and me and my friends here in Milwaukee are just in it for ourselves, there will inevitably be a conflict that will be detrimental to both of us. So I feel like,
But in that moment, like, it's the definition of a national emergency. Like, the reason that Donald Trump shouldn't declare the wall a national emergency is because not everybody thinks it's an emergency. But when it's a national emergency, we all know how we felt. Those of us who are older than probably 30 know how we felt on 9/11. Like,
right.
That was a national emergency.
Right.
But you also look back, like, I'd encourage you to read Black Banner by Ali Soufan, who was really one of the only Arab-speaking FBI agents who was investigating the Cole, investigating bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And like you really see, wow, the government had so many warning signs that 9/11 was going to happen, and it was mostly because of our interventions in Saudi Arabia after Desert Storm specifically. Like I'm not blaming America for 9/11, but we certainly did not. We took people from Milwaukee, and we put Milwaukee interest in the middle of Saudi Arabia, and made Saudi Arabians have an interest in Milwaukee. And so I look at it and I go, like, Indiana and Milwaukee, the only time that they're ever going to really, like, the only time that Milwaukee and Indianapolis are really going to coordinate with, the only time that they should coordinate with Saudi Arabia is when it's in both of their mutual interests. And so if you are calling someone in Brazil saying, I need coffee because I have a coffee shop in Milwaukee, that's a healthy, positive relationship for both sides. Right. And so that interaction is what will raise the standard of living in Brazil and raise the standard of living in Milwaukee, because it's a voluntary exchange between two people. And so those two people, now if the person in Brazil screws you, then you might go to Guatemala. They have great coffee too. Like, it's lesson learned, you know? So, right. But the punishment for the person in Brazil is that they no longer have access to a very wealthy market. They no longer have the revenue that you come, like, that's their punishment for their bad behavior, you know, because realistically you can't go to, you know, you can't put them in jail if they're in Brazil. Like, it's, so
is there ever, is there
you and
ever,
I have, hold on, one final point, like, you and I have these shared interests, and we care about so much because we're put into too big of a container, and we're all told, you have to care about everything that all of America cares about, and all of America has to care about all of the world. And the human brain right now is so insane because we're so overloaded, instead of just going, I can handle my own little piece of the world today. Right. And like, that's what you're good at, handling your own little piece of the world. And most people are going to thrive when that's the situation, as opposed to Saudi Arabia feeling forced to deal with what Milwaukee cares about.
Yeah, but doesn't what goes on in the rest of the world impact your ability to function in your little slice of the world? I mean, take the Saudi Arabian example. You know, it's in Milwaukee's best interest. It's in Indianapolis's best interest to have oil, you know, at a price that allows for $2 a gallon, not $6 a gallon, right? So there are externalities out there that impact our ability to do what it is that we need to do.
I agree. Right? But I also think that that network of complex exchanges is what eventually means that Saudi Arabia and Milwaukee will coordinate.
Gotcha.
It is you going, you know what? Damn, I have a car. I need to put gas in it. How do I get gas? Who makes gas? Right. And so you get, you know, and it sounds so simplistic, but we do it on a daily basis. Like, you know, I met Frank, and Frank goes, I have this problem. I want to start podcasts. How do I do this? And then, you know, he finds me, and then I help him, and then he helps me. And you know, so we do it on a daily basis where we have these voluntary exchanges. Right. And the time when we just become crazy is when those exchanges become involuntary. Right. And so, right. Yeah, it is in our interest to have a relationship with the Saudi Arabia, but in my world, you're not having, you don't have an interest in all of Saudi Arabia. You have an interest in one person in Saudi Arabia, and right. Their well-being is your well-being, but you can manage that relationship. You can't manage the relationships of all these little complex networks. Like, I just think, right. Like, I look at it as an untenable goal for a government of really any size, but specifically more than maybe a county-sized government, to try and think that they can determine what is the best outcome for billions of people on this planet. Like, I have fundamental issues with, you know, some portions of the libertarian philosophy, because the population is going to hit 9 billion at some point, and it probably, right. Some people think it'll trail off there. But so, like, these little communities of people, like, how do you make that manageable in a world of 9 billion people? Right. Because we're so tribal, we want to group ourselves. But do you see my point in that? Yeah,
I agree. I mean, I you've convinced me, you know, in terms of I love the concept. And I guess what I'm trying to wrap my head around is just what you said, in a world of soon to be 9 billion people, how do all of these individual entities and these smaller groups function efficiently when we're competing on a global scale?
Yeah, and
that's just what I struggle with, is that
I think
like
maybe
it,
the missing piece is justice. Like so I think the missing piece for a lot of people is justice, because they just think, oh, in a world of these complex, exchanges, and we're not giving it a name anymore. It's not, like we think of markets, we think of the NASDAQ stock exchange, but like I'm asking you to think in terms of your own personal life. Like you don't really need to care about Saudi Arabians. It's not that you shouldn't. Like empathy, like you have empathy for Venezuelans, but like they don't need you. They don't want you in their country. They don't need you intervening in their constitutional crisis. They want you intervening in their constitutional crisis as much as they want you intervening in ours. But like what they do want is a paycheck. What they do want is economic opportunity. And so if American companies can make that happen, then great. Like the idea that billionaires shouldn't exist to me is kind of foolish, because that just means that somebody was so efficient at creating something, that wealth amassed so quickly, that they now are able to create trust. And yeah, maybe some people hold on to it, but I mean, all the biggest billionaires in America are giving away all their money. Like Bill Gates is going, I amassed so much wealth so quickly because I'm so efficient that I'm going to solve malaria. So he's, that wealth that was created by Carnegie created libraries, and so like in hospitals, and a lot of what the government does today, like billionaires used to take care of in a society that didn't have a strong central government. Sure. Because of their empathy, their personal empathy, they saw one person that tugged on their emotional heartstrings, and they went, I've got to help. I'm burdened by my wealth. I've got to get rid of it, And so the Scrooges of the world, I think we think in terms, because I think there are people who think in the choice between business and government, I'm going to choose government. But I look at it and go, those are the same people that are going to form businesses. Those are the same people that you see on the street that flip you off. Like those are the same, like just because you call it government, it doesn't mean that the individuals inside that institution aren't going to make the same self-indulgent decisions that they would if they were in another container. Like it doesn't. And so, but if you rip me off, if you hit me, it's the non-aggression principle. I will not use force on you to achieve social or political goals. Every person who joins the Libertarian Party signs that pledge. Mm-hmm. And because you pledge not to use force to solve society's problems. But that doesn't mean that if you punch me, there are no consequences. Because if you hit me, I get to hit you back. It just means that I can't hit you first. Like we have to find a peaceful way to solve our disagreement. But if you hit me, I have the right to hit you back. I have the right to take you to, a judge or a police officer and say, this person hit me. And so if you steal my property, if you lie to me, if you try to defraud me, if you try to embezzle from me, then there are consequences to those things, because going back to the common law, there's a framework for responsible human behavior, and those who violate those rules, there are consequences. So it's not like you get to just kill whoever you want and there's no consequences. Like your immediate community will take care of that. I don't know what that looks like. I can't. I'm not good at telling you exactly what your structure will look like and naming it and giving you a label of what a stateless society would exactly look like. There are people much better at that than I. But I think in terms of your day-to-day life, it's not going to be a heck of a lot different. It'll probably be a lot wealthier, and it will probably be a lot happier, because you're not reading in the news about how some politician is trying to make you do something you don't want to do. And that frustration that you feel because, like, I really encourage listeners, if you've made it this far into it, like really get at the root of what is making you angry about the news. And what really, let me ask you, Dave, like when you really kind of boil it down, this is more of a homework assignment, but can you really think about like when you read the news, like what subject really just pisses you off?
I would say a perceived lack of empathy.
Okay. So like, give me an example. Like there's one subject that you read it and you're just like, F that.
Well, I think, there's a number, but the current immigration discussion, I think, is one of them.
Okay.
That
So like, what about that really just frustrates you?
What frustrates me is what I perceive to be a lot of misinformation out there about the threat of illegal immigration, and what I perceive to be people that aren't dealing with reality numbers, quantifiable, verifiable facts, but instead are dealing more from a what I might call tribal or gut feeling.
Okay.
And I'm trying to be fairly political about how I say that, but there is in my mind a sort of lack of empathy out there that certain current news stories are sort of bringing to light, that I guess in my naivete I didn't really realize was out there.
Yeah. Okay. So
and so yeah, it's kind of it's a shock. It's more of a shock and a surprise. It's sort of a what? Wait, there are people that believe that?
So is it fair to say you're mad about lying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's fair. And lying, but not only lying outwardly, but lying inwardly. Right. We talked about it in the beginning about how some people don't want to admit certain things because admitting them has implications, and they're afraid of the implications. Right.
Okay. So what implications are they afraid of?
In that particular instance, in the instance we're talking about with immigration, I think that if they were to really let their empathy show, there may be an implication that I cannot support certain policies if I view this individual as fully human, as having a life as important, as rich, as valuable as mine. That empathy and that connection would potentially create, the implication would be, well, then I would have to oppose certain things that are trying to be done.
Right. So, okay. So you said policies. What policies? So like, I'm for open borders because I don't believe in restricting. I don't believe it. I think labor is the same as capital is the same as goods. Like putting a restriction on labor, like the government shouldn't tell me who I can and can't hire.
Right.
Like I'm, in my world, there are no borders. You voluntarily associate with people. It's governed by contracts. So there's negotiations ahead of time before you enter into that relationship. Be it a marital relationship, a business relationship, and those who violate their contracts suffer penalties for that. Right. So that's how I would organize society. I don't need borders. I don't need walls. I don't need any of that stuff kind of getting in the way of any of that. Right.
That's interesting. I like that. Yeah.
So I'm not going to make you say you're for open borders, but would you say you're more towards my line of thinking than maybe like a closed border situation? Like, how would you, like, when you say policies,
right?
Fundamentally, let me distill it down. You're mad about someone lying about policies.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So is it,
I would say, to answer your question, I'm not an open border person at this point. I do believe in having a secure border. I do believe in some degree of fencing and all the semantics that are getting thrown around. I've been surprised at the way that quite honestly, Central American immigrants have been characterized in the popular media. Right. That to me was, rather than saying, look, these are mothers and children, and they're as valuable human beings as you and your mother, and they're just trying to get here to make a better life for themselves. But the reality of our current situation is that we cannot accept everybody that wants to be here.
Sure.
I would wholeheartedly embrace that, right? But instead, I think what's happening, especially in this particular topic, is, it's rapists and murderers, it's potential terrorists, it's the characterization is bringing out. It's dehumanizing. And to me, that takes what could be a reasonable discussion about what we can and cannot handle as a country, right?
Right.
And doing it in an empathetic way and doing it in a humanizing and appropriate way, it has turned it into a discussion that it never should have been in the first place. And that's something where I feel the dehumanizing aspect of it really is angering me, because I didn't realize that undercurrent was out there. I didn't realize that message would resonate with as many people as it has.
You and I are from the North. And so, I'm from Indianapolis, you're from Milwaukee. And, I grew up in a town that was the national meeting place for the Quakers, and was a major underground railroad stop. Most of the houses downtown built before the Civil War have underground railroad basements.
Yep.
I was having a conversation with a friend in Georgia recently about Gen Z kids who do racist stuff, and my jaw hit the floor, because it just didn't occur to me that racism was my brain couldn't process that people actually
right.
Were they joking? It had to be a joke, right? They were
right.
going for a cheap laugh. It just didn't occur to me. I think sometimes in the North, especially, or when you've been, I think, we don't have to think about the things that Al thinks about, what
right.
he's talking about. You and I don't leave the house and think that we might not come home. I got pulled over last Friday night. It never occurred to me until he got a little hostile that I could
right.
be in danger of being hurt. But the second those lights go on for Al, it's a different story, right?
Exactly.
So it's just kind of hard, I think, because you and I probably associate with a certain type of person who have the same values that you just kind of outlined. You have built a community around empathy. You don't dehumanize people. You don't accept lying. You don't accept fraud. And so you have built a community that deals in those terms. Right. And there are communities, despite the ultimate referee being in existence, those communities have still managed to build themselves. And it's is there a law that I can pass that is going to change their heart? Or how do I actually change a racist thinking? How do I change, and I'm not saying anybody who is for
right.
closed borders or a wall is a racist. That's not what I'm saying.
Right. I understand what you're saying.
I think there are some people who are motivated, and I get your argument that, if I were president tomorrow, I couldn't advocate for open borders, because it's all right, at least I do these things because there's steps to, I'm telling you my end goal.
Right.
But, you've formed yourself into a certain community. They've, a racist, let's say a Klan member, has formed themselves into a community, to put a fine point on it.
Right.
And those things happen regardless of whether the government was there or not. And
well, I'll say one response to that. And yes, I do think that laws change opinions over time. So if you take, for example, Milwaukee's an extremely segregated city still to this day, and that goes all the way back to the housing segregations, right? Mm-hmm. The redlining and so when fair housing came about, over time, what is happening, and not necessarily in that generation, but over time, what is happening is greater and greater exposure and integration, which is then breaking down those barriers. So I would say, the high school that I went to when Frank and I went to the high school, I think there was probably 4 African Americans, the entire high school. And at that point, it was one of the larger high schools in the state. Right now, my kids go to that high school, and it's, I believe, almost 50% minority. And that's phenomenal, because here you have a situation that you have 50% Caucasian, 50% minority, and there really isn't much racial tension or racial issue in that school. Right. And so I think that, you know, if there wouldn't have been Civil Rights Act, if there wouldn't have been fair housing, if there wouldn't have been a lot of this legislation that is breaking down those barriers and forcing integration, you wouldn't necessarily have the scenario now where minorities and Caucasians can go to school together and not think twice about it.
But
right?
In some cases, you know, here in Indianapolis, you know, we had Chris Spangle, which Oscar Robertson, the great basketball player, went to. Mm-hmm. And everybody was segregated. You know, it was government policy that kind of put everybody. And fair housing is sometimes a poor example, because some places like Chicago or here in Indianapolis, there was fair housing, but it ended up becoming a slum, because right. You're pushing people of a certain socioeconomic class in together, right, and they become dependent on that particular government policy. And then, so it's, I mean, to me, like, I went to a school that was 98% white. The 2% was Muslim. We have a major Muslim, you know, which was fascinating, being 18 and 9/11 happening in my senior year, like watching best friends who were Muslim go through what they had to go through. But, you know, I kind of grew up naive about race, you know, because we grew up in this, you know, community of Quakers that had certain values that were enshrined 3 generations before, you know, and my naivete could probably be best expressed sometimes as, I don't know if racist, but you'd be like, wow, that's ignorant. And it wasn't until, it wasn't a government program, it was work, it was capitalism that ultimately brought down those racial barriers. Like, I was always a very hardcore pro, you know, crackdown on immigration type conservative. And then I worked for a garden center, and then I worked with Hispanics for the first time and saw the family values, the sense of community, the deep rooted, you know, Christian values of the Catholic Church were expressed through these people, through these folks. And it was just kind of like, oh, maybe I'm wrong about immigrants. Maybe they're here for these reasons. And like, it's capitalism that kind of broke that down. And I think that is the way that it is for most people.
I agree with you. I agree. I think capitalism has a wonderful opportunity to break down those barriers. I really do. I mean, I think that, you know, if you're running a company and you have profit incentive, it doesn't matter if it's male, female, black, white, what have you. It is a great equalizer. But you have to make sure that the opportunity to achieve is equally spread out, if that makes sense. So,
right, because I think diversity is brought about by exposure, which usually comes about by economic interest, which going back to each person's interest. Like, I think if you look at gay marriage, like, you know, that's an issue where society led by culture, led by Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, did more for the gay movement than any politician did, except for maybe Harvey Milk. You know, like, because as a young man who just said a lot of the things that Eminem said, watching Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, I was exposed to gay culture, for gay people for the first time, and I went, actually kind of nice. Like, they're real people. Like, I just, so, and again, that's more of a free market. So, like, how do you view do you view government as an arbiter of morality or as a fundamentally moral institution?
No, I think it's an arbiter of, as we were talking about earlier, this sort of the public sphere, this empty space, right? And it's the referee that keeps that space empty. It's the referee that says it doesn't have a particular morality. It doesn't have a particular religion that it enforces. It doesn't have a particular ethos or anything. It just basically says within this sphere, everybody has to be treated equally. Right.
Now, how did you come to this conclusion? On what information are you making this informed judgment?
Well, and I guess I should preface that by saying that's not what I believe it is currently. That's what I believe it should be, right? And how I came to that, I mean, I years and years of thinking. I mean, my background, my undergrad was in history and political science, and so it's just something I've always been interested in, and just thinking about it, sort of like my biggest, I mean, you mentioned you're a Christian. My biggest concern, or one of my biggest concerns, is that there will be a resurgence in attempting to define how the public sphere is managed. And I'm more of a secularist, and that scares me in the sense, because I don't want any one ideology, any one religion, any one thought process to sway that neutrality that should be out there in the public sphere.
So in what I've laid out over the 5 hours that we've talked,
I know we do got to wrap it up, don't we?
Yeah. But over the course of the conversations that we've had on the 3 podcasts, do you hear much room for a public sphere? Would you say that there is a public sphere in the way that you understand it, in the worldview that I've articulated?
That there is a public sphere? Yes, I do think there is a public sphere. It seems to be, in my mind, more chaotic than neutral, if that makes sense.
Would you say that it is easier or harder to control the public sphere in my worldview?
My gut inclination is to say, in your worldview, it would be more difficult to control the public sphere.
And why is that?
Because you don't have a centralized system of enforcement of neutrality.
And you have an increased amount of choice.
That's true. Yeah.
So I, as a Christian, can be the largest Christian broadcaster in the world if I wanted to. But if I'm one of 50 broadcasters instead of one of 3, my influence doesn't mean as much. And so my worldview is built on persuasion. My worldview is built on persuading you that I'm right. My worldview is not built on forcing you to live the way that I think you ought to live. Like, I was an atheist and I became a Christian because I was persuaded. I had homophobic beliefs, and then I became persuaded to not have those beliefs anymore.
Right.
I was very pro-military. I'm pro-military, but I was very pro-war.
Right.
And then I became persuaded that I wasn't. And I think that when you want to change society in terms of positive values, and the reason I'm anti-war is because I think it's less violent. It doesn't promote. I'm a non-violent person. It fits into my worldview. You know, I think I don't want anybody to get the idea that I'm not for soldiers or veterans or anything, because I definitely don't think that way. And I'm not anti-police. I just think that the people that make decisions make bad decisions. And amazingly, like this will be telling. On my Facebook page of 95,000 people for We Are Libertarians, the #1 job is veteran. I have more veterans and military members that like the We Are Libertarians Facebook page than any other job group. And it's because those guys went in as young guys looking for economic opportunity and believing a certain set of things, and then got into the military and realized that's not why we're here. Right. We're here to do whatever those guys want us to do, and it's not my values are not in line with theirs. And so what's the alternative? And so libertarians offer, it's why Ron Paul and Gary Johnson and non-interventionists in general seem to get most of the military support when it comes to election time. So
no, you're right. You're definitely right.
And so my worldview, when it comes to the public sphere, it's harder to control because you have more choice and you have less channels to be controlled. It's not that there won't be institutions that are controlled by powerful interests, but you have more of an ability to escape those interests and to live as you see fit, as you'd like to govern yourself.
Right. That makes sense.
It's hard to grasp.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it, Chris. We should probably start to wrap it up. I think we've gone, at least an hour, if not more. Yeah, almost 2 hours. But,
this is like a walk in the park for me. I could go.
Yeah. I mean, I could honestly sit here and do this for hours, but no, I appreciate it, and I'd love to do it again sometime. And you've definitely opened my eyes to a different approach to things. That's for sure. So
yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad I could persuade you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it.
I'd hate to have to come over and beat you up and tell you this is what you're doing.
Yeah, I would hate that as well. But
of course, that's the point.
Yeah.
All right, it was great to talk to you, Dave.
Yeah, you as well.